Our next guest is John Lee Dumas. Now, for those of you who don't know about podcasts, there are over 4 million podcasts in the world. I've had my podcast for about 7 years. And though I have interviewed people like Elon Musk and Buzz Aldrin and a lot of people, I'm actually very excited to interview John Lee Dumas because in any field you're in, you want to meet those that are on top. But more important than John just being on the top of his game with podcasts, I was so struck by how authentic this man is, meaning he literally posts all his income statements and all this stuff on his website. But before we get into how transparent John is, I always love the backstory. I always love where'd you get the cool hair, where you grew up, where you're a problem child like I was. Where did you grow up and where did you have a spark that you might have this entrepreneurial dream in you as a kid?
All right. Well, first off, between the two of us, you definitely have the cool hair. Let's be
Thank
honest.
you, thank you, thank you.
Number two, it was great to meet you in real life, in person, last week in Orlando. Chris and I both spoke at Podfest, which was a great event, and getting to see you, up in front of the audience and just kind of answering questions and doing things was really cool to see. So I wanted to commend you for that.
Thank you, John.
And for me, I grew up in Maine, just a small town boy. Went to college on an Army scholarship, and so after I graduated college, I spent 8 years as an officer in the U.S. Army. I did a little 13-month tour of duty in Iraq as a tank commander, which essentially means I was in charge of 4 tanks and 16 men. After the Army, I decided to try, let's get a career. Let's try the real world. And I tried a bunch of things, went to law school, corporate finance, commercial real estate. And, I had some successes over those 6 years, but I would like really call those 6 years a struggle because I just wasn't finding happiness or fulfillment in my work. I was having a fun time on the weekends and at night, hanging out with my friends, but I wasn't enjoying work. It wasn't fulfilling. So I started reading all the books, Chris, like, Think and Grow Rich, fill in the blank, just like all the classics. And I started listening to audiobooks in my car, which kind of led me to listening to podcasts. And then before I knew it, I was just like, man, I am loving these podcasts that are interviewing these successful entrepreneurs that are talking about their story, their journey, their experience in life. Like, I love that. And I remember going to Apple Podcast Store and saying, I'm going to subscribe to the show that does this 7 days a week, because why wouldn't there be a show that does that? And lo and behold, there was no show doing a daily show interviewing entrepreneurs. They were all once a week, twice a month, which just wasn't enough content for me. And again, this is back in 2012. There just wasn't that many shows doing any content, let alone what I wanted. So I said, hey, why not be that change you want to see in the world and go forth and conquer? So I launched Entrepreneurs on Fire back in 2012 as the first daily podcast in the world interviewing entrepreneurs. Here we are 12 and a half years later, still the only daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs in the world. 4,500 episodes under our belt, 160 million listens. A lot of fun, a lot of great experiences, a lot of products, services, coaching, mastermind events along the way. It's been a great journey. And here I am now, 2025 in Puerto Rico, loving life.
Thank you for that, John. I had a chance to see John as well on stage, and I really admire how open and transparent you are, right? Literally, the guy that gave you advice because you asked him, hey, I'm thinking of doing it every day. He was like, that's kind of like a stupid idea. And you followed your gut. And again, this show is about gifts, meaning your stories give to the world, which is why it's called the Gifters Podcast. It's sponsored by the Gifter X Talk, which has been called the TED Talks for Entrepreneurs. But I like knowing when you are literally eating dirt or you're doubtful, because it's easy if you get friends. Literally, if you saw John there, everyone's like, "Oh my God, this guy's a rock star!" Right? So he's kind of a big deal in the podcast world, but he has this genuineness because John, I speak all around the world. You speak all around the world, and not everyone is that way. Like they're on stage one way, and they're off stage is like something completely different, right? But I saw you on stage sharing your story, off stage talking, connecting, and I admire that. But I'm curious, in the beginning stages, I want to give people inspiration and those moments of grit. It's very easy to see you as you are now. But what are some of those lessons? Was it through your wife's support or reading the Bible, whatever it might be? I'm just curious. I want to give our listeners and viewers, what are some of those things when you are eating dirt, John?
Listen, you got to eat dirt. It's all about eating dirt and then really finding out what's working down there and then saying, okay, of all this dirt that I've been chewing, this is like the one little pebble that makes sense. Now I'm going to polish that pebble. I'm going to go all in with that one thing. And that's kind of what I was doing and what I've, kind of been trying to figure out since I launched Entrepreneurs on Fire. Like I can remember when I launched, my mentor at the time, Jamie Masters of the Eventual Millionaire, said, like, how do you think you're going to make money? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I thought you were supposed to tell me that. You're my mentor. She's like, well, you can, do this or that. But, at the end of the day, there's not a lot of ways to make money from your podcast. So you've got to kind of think of other things. And I remember being like, ooh, that's going to be challenging. And of course, since then I built a 7-figure business around just my podcast. So that ended up not being true. It was just a limiting belief that she had that she imparted upon to me. And then I then had to kind of get into the dirt, mix things around, try some things that did not work. I tried a lot of things that did not work. I can remember some of the early emails that I sent out, trying to drum up some revenue. It just was not, makes you cringe now. But you learn from that. Like you make mistakes, you ask people, you get advice, you take their advice, it's bad advice, and you try to change things and go for it a different way, or you get advice and it's good advice and you double down on that. And so it's just kind of getting up every day, living in the dirt, grinding it out, chewing it up, spitting it out, kind of dissecting what's working, what's not working. And that's why I love doing a daily show because it's about me putting in the reps. Because, Chris, I was not a good interviewer when I launched. In fact, I was quite poor. I did not know how to conduct an interview, I did not know how to facilitate a conversation. I was bad at podcasting, and I was a podcast host of a daily show. But guess what? I got good. I don't want to say quick, but I got good quicker than I would have if I was doing it once a week because who gets good at doing anything once a week? Like I had to get up every day and get just a little bit better. There's this book I love by Jeff Olson called The Slight Edge. Really inspired me of just saying, if you're going to do something, do it right, go all in, wake up every day, chew that dirt, and just make it happen. So that was my focus, getting up every day. And the first 3, 4, 5 years was a grind. But then you build a team and you start to have systems and tools and automations. And now like there's some days where I'm like, I have too much time on my hands because I've got such a great team, such great systems and tools. And I realized that my goal in life is not to make the most money I can possibly make, but to make a lot of revenue on my terms, on my schedule. And that's where I'm kind of focused at now. So there's just so much growth that goes into being an entrepreneur. The biggest takeaway from everything that I just shared is you got to find that one thing that you want to go all in on and just latch onto that thing like a dog to a bone and then just don't let go and wake up every day and do it.
That's awesome. John, you shared a line before where you're saying we must be the change we wish to see in the world. And that was a Gandhi line, I believe. And the whole eating dirt thing, I remember that Gandhi also said, because I always want to learn from people like you, from Gandhi, and that might seem like, oh my gosh, but again, I see us all as people, right? But he said, I want to be more humble than dirt. And it always reminds me, you only see things truly the world when you're actually prostrate on the ground, eating dirt, chewing on dirt. And like you, I've had various instances in my life from eating dirt, and I still eat dirt all the time now. And I like how it tastes now, actually. I just put some soy sauce and some lobster sauce on there. But um, I want to commend you because what you do with your business and your podcast, I said this to you when I first met you. I'm like, hey, you helped me make millions of bucks because I was working on my podcast 5 years ago. I restarted it and I was literally 800 interviews in. Now, at that time, unfortunately, my mom and dad had passed away. COVID happened. My speaking career fell off a cliff. So I was like, well, what do I do with my life? I'm grieving. I don't want to cry every day. So I literally just channel all this energy in 2020 and I interviewed 961 people for 10 minutes.
Wow.
But after about 800 interviews, like you, I'm like, how could I monetize this? I was getting people to be clients, but I looked at your website and I said, oh wow, I think at the time you're like saying you have to either sponsor it or you have to buy a bunch of books. But I'm like, oh wow, this is cool. You have this status, you have this ability to affect change. So I said, okay, I'm not a podcast guru, a podcast level guy as you are at the time, but I have traveled the world. I have spoken to various people. I have interviewed many individuals like Elon Musk. So I literally started charging for my guests because it takes time. Because as you know, probably that not only does it take time to interview people, it also takes time to be a great storyteller. So I would always preface my clients and guests before the podcast. I was like, "Can I have your permission to be honest?" They say yes. I'm like, "Look, man, you got to share some honest, open, authentic stories. Like, I don't want to share that both my parents passed away during that time of COVID, right? But I share that because hopefully people listening know that we're real, we're authentic, and we're genuine. So I'm just giving you mad props for giving me an idea on how to monetize. And I'm letting you know and letting people listening to know that you don't necessarily need to know how you're making an impact. You're planting those seeds. And in time, those seeds grow in someone's heart, and ideally, they grow into a cool thing, right? But I just want to let you know, John, like you make an impact on people, which I'm probably sure you've heard of. But during one of the darkest moments of my life, I was like, what do I do? And just looking at your website, looking at how authentic you are, looking how transparent you are, it gave me a very clear understanding. Oh, wow, own your worth and charge for your worth. So for you, John, what are some just what my father called invisible happiness, meaning he used to be a social worker in New York City, and just randomly someone would walk up to him and give him a compliment. And like me, this is kind of like my invisible happiness gift to you. So for yourself, if people are scared about having a podcast, don't know what to do, what are some just cool, fun, awesome stories where someone just tells you about how your podcast changed, moved, or transformed, or even saved their lives?
Honestly, one thing happened while we were at Podfest. I had somebody come up to me while I was hanging out at the bar, just kind of having some food, having a drink, and they sat down and we were having a conversation. And they said, John, back in 2018, I listened to this one podcast episode about branding, and it just gave me these ideas and these thoughts that I had never had before. I ended up signing up for that person who was on your show, their course, their community. And I learned all this thing, all these things about branding and about marketing that I never even thought of before. I never would have come up with on my own. And now for 7 years, I've been running a very successful business all around branding. I've helped so many people, and it was honestly not even on my radar. I went for a run. I popped on your episode. I pressed play on a random one, and it just happened to be the one I needed to hear at that time. And that just really impacted my life. And there was like tears in the eyes, and there was like she was shaking a little bit because she was kind of thinking back to that time where she was headed in such a different direction in life. And then just pressing play on one episode just poof, changed that direction, and she was off to the races. And then here, 7 years later, she's sitting down at a bar with myself, having a drink, telling me the story, relaying it, and like well on the other side of it. And it was really impactful to kind of have that face to face. And actually, right after our chat today, I'm getting on a call with a woman who emailed me last week. And she talked about how she picked up my book back in 2021. And she told me it was the most random story. Like she got into a taxi and she was going to some random events, and she was kind of feeling lost and a little lonely, and she was trying to figure out where she was at in life. And she was kind of telling that to the Uber driver. Actually, she was in an Uber, and the Uber driver turned around and he handed her my book, and he said, "You know what? A couple days ago, some woman was in my Uber, gave me this book, and said, 'Hang on to it. You'll know who to give this to, and it'll be
Mhm.
within 1 week.'" That's what this woman told the Uber driver, and the Uber driver said, "You're that person." And she took the book, she read it, and she said it completely changed her life. She went in a different direction. She followed my 17-step process, and boom, now she's just having, success on levels she never thought possible before. And I'm actually going to learn a lot more about that, and quite soon when I jump on this call with her. So that'll be really interesting to hear even more of that story. But it's just things like that. And those are the spoken stories, but there's just so many unspoken stories, because the word that I use is the ripple effect. I love the fact that right now somebody in this world is listening to an episode that I did in 2014 or 2017 or fill in the blank. And for whatever reason, that episode is speaking to them. And even though I did it over a decade ago, it's still going to have a positive and massive impact in their life, because that's what my show is. It's saying, how can I have a guest on that has value to share, that can share that value with the audience, that's not going to be relevant to some, and it will be unbelievably relevant to others, but there's always that chance. And I'm multiplying that by doing 365 per year. I'm not doing 800 a year like you, but I'm doing my best.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, John. And Last question before we end this podcast. Your name, Entrepreneur on Fire, is awesome. You talk about branding. What's one suggestion you might have for someone out there that wants to potentially brand their podcast in a way? Were there some tips you can share with us? Because I know you're a big fan of Seth Godin, I think his name is. He's amazing. He's so precise with his words.
He's
Any
very
advice on
precise.
branding for podcast titles?
Yes, absolutely. What I always recommend for people to do, because we run this community called Podcasters Paradise, it's all about helping podcasters create, grow, and monetize their own podcast. One of the first tutorials I make sure people go through is creating your avatar. This is before you come up with your podcast name, because until you know who your avatar is, that is your ideal listener of your show, there's no way you know what the name of your podcast should be, because you should probably not be deciding the name of your podcast. And what I mean by that is your ideal listener should be like, who is your ideal listener? What are their struggles, their obstacles, their challenges? Once you know that avatar, that ideal listener, then step back and say, what is the name of a show that would stop them in their tracks because it would speak to them? And that show name would say, this is for me. You know, like the John Dumas show would not speak to many people, especially when I launched it back in 2012. But Entrepreneurs on Fire speaks to who I'm trying to get to, who are entrepreneurs who are on fire, who are on their way to becoming on fire, who know that they need to hear from entrepreneurs who are on fire to educate them, to inspire them. So start with the avatar, start with your ideal listener, the person that you are trying to speak to, and then go from there.
That's awesome. John, thank you so much for being on our podcast. How can our guests and audience members stay in touch with you?
Well,
Learn
the
from you.
show is Entrepreneurs on Fire. Check it out on any podcasting app that you love to listen to. My website is eofire.com. A lot of free courses there, and links to our podcast as well.
Great. John, thanks so much for your time.